Hello, my name is Connor Quinlan. In this review, I'm going to be doing a review on the Tokina 12-24mm f-stop 4 lens. And what I'm going to talk about in this review are my first thoughts right out of the box, and also the image quality, the focusing, and how this lens did in the field. First thing I'm going to talk about is the first look. What did I think about it right when it came out of the box and when I put it on the camera? Well, look and feel of this is actually very nice. It's actually much better than the Nikon version, the Nikon 10-24mm. It feels extremely solid and tough, and the focus rings are very, very smooth throughout the entire range. This is definitely a very professionally made lens, and that's very nice for a third-party lens because you wouldn't think that they would be as nicely built as the Nikon. This is actually probably built even better. It feels a lot sturdier, and everything feels very, very smoothly on this lens. I'm going to talk about a couple things that I noticed on this lens that are definitely pluses for this lens. And that is definitely the focus ring, the very large focus ring that you have here. Now, in order to change it from AF to manual, you'll have to do this. Now it's in manual mode, and as you can see the thing turning there. It turns to AF mode, you have to pull it up. Now you can see it doesn't move these numbers. It's because it's in autofocus mode. But yeah, one thing that I really like about this lens is the large manual focus ring. Now you don't get that with the Nikon version and a lot of the other third-party version lenses that are in this category. And it's definitely a plus for this lens because it's very easy to grab and very easy to use. The only real downside of the focusing ring is that doing this is kind of tedious. It kind of takes quite a bit of pressure to push it down. And as you can see, it does that clicking, so it's not a very smooth transaction. But it's not bad. I mean, it's not a bad idea. It's just not the most efficient way, in my opinion. I wish they would have done is had it so that it could do both autofocus and manual focus at the same time, like a Nikon lens. But sadly, the Tokina does not. But it's still pretty efficient and it works very well. One other thing that I don't particularly care for about this lens is how close the zoom is to the very front of the lens. It can be a little bit uncomfortable on a camera when your hand's way up there. You can't really get a good grip on it, so it's really close to the camera, a little too close for my taste, but really not that big a deal. It's still easy to grab and easy to use. All in all, what really impresses me most about this lens is really how professionally made it is. I've already talked about the build quality of this lens, how solid it is, but also the fact that it uses a constant f-stop of 4 is really, really nice and makes it much more pro in my eye. You know, not even the new Nikon 10-24mm has a constant f-stop anymore, which is too bad because that's really definitely a pro feature. It makes the Tokina lens very nice. Now the next thing I'm going to talk about this lens is the image quality, but first I'm just going to put it on a camera body so you get an idea of what it looks like on a camera. Now this is a Nikon D3, so it's a pretty big body, but you can kind of get an idea of what this lens would look like on a Nikon camera, or pretty much any camera, to give you a little bit of scale of how large this lens is. You can take a look at the front here. Pretty much looks the same as the Nikon 10-24 in the front, or any other zoom in this class. Now the next thing I'm going to talk about in this review is the image quality of this lens, and to do that I'm going to actually take you over to my computer and we're going to take a look at some of the sample images that I took with this lens. Alright, now we're looking at the sample images from the Tokina 12-24mm lens on my computer, and what we're going to start with is sharpness of the lens first. Now this is taken at 12mm at f-stop 4, and we're going to look at the center sharpness as I go up or as I get smaller with the f-stops. Here's the center of the image at f-stop 4. And as we go to 5.6, you can see a pretty dramatic increase in sharpness. At the very wide end at 12mm, f-stop 5.6 is about as sharp as the lens gets. From there it does get slightly sharper if you shift it up to f-stop 8, but from there it's pretty much the same throughout, and then diffraction will take place and it'll get softer at f-stops past 16. Now the corners at f-stop 4, believe it or not, are actually pretty good. I was very surprised actually to see how sharp the corners were. I'd say they are pretty much just as sharp as Nikon's version of this lens, the Nikon 12-24mm lens, which is definitely surprising for a third-party lens. The greatest place where you can see the difference between f-stops is right down here in the gravel area in the corner. Starting with f-stop 4, which we have right now, when we go to f-stop 5.6, you can see a real dramatic increase in the sharpness in those pebbles. And then f-stop 8, there's not much of a difference, but it does increase in sharpness slightly. Now we're going to move on to 24mm at f-stop 4. We're going to look right in the center here at this swirl. As we go up in f-stop to f-stop 5.6, you can see already a huge dramatic increase in sharpness in the center of the image. And then at f-stop 8 is when you see the most dramatic increase in sharpness at 24mm. You definitely want to try to use f-stop 8 to get the maximum sharpness, because the sharpness really increases greatly when you go from f-stop 5.6 to f-stop 8. Now the image at 24mm is a little soft at f-stop 4 throughout the entire image. It is also a little bit soft in the corners. And now we're going to take a look at the difference between the corners. Here we are at f-stop 4. 5.6, you can see sharpness increases quite a bit. By f-stop 8 though, it once again increases pretty dramatically, and you've got an overall sharp image in the corners. By f-stop 8, every focal length of this lens is pretty much tack sharp all the way out through the corners. It is definitely a very sharp lens, and definitely competes with the Nikon in terms of sharpness. It is pretty dang close to being as sharp as the Nikon. Now we're going to talk about the flare on the lens. This one's taken at 24mm with the sun right in the corner here, as you can see. And the flare control of this lens is actually extremely good, a lot better than I thought it would be. You can only see some minor flaring here. And to avoid that flare, all you really need to do is keep your lens a little bit further away from the sun, or cover it up with your hand or something like that, and you won't have any flare in your picture at all. And here's flare at 12mm, and as you can see, the flare is once again pretty small, just a little bit right here. If you move your camera over a little bit and keep your sun out of that corner of the image, you won't have any flare in your image whatsoever. The only part at 12mm where there seems to be quite a bit of flare is here in this corner. And you can see that real red flare down there. And in order to keep from doing that, just make sure your sun is not in the very corner of the image, and you won't have that problem. Next thing I want to talk about is distortion with this image. Now, it's just from looking at this image, you can't really see any distortion at all, and the distortion at 12mm is not very noticeable. But if you do look carefully, you do see some curving in this fence here. So there is some noticeable distortion. If you're taking pictures of a flat horizon, you definitely may want to correct that in Photoshop, in which this distortion is very easy to correct in Photoshop. Throughout the rest of the range though, other than at 12mm, there's pretty much no noticeable distortion, which is really nice. Alright, the next image quality thing I want to talk about is vignetting in the corners. And the only noticeable time you see vignetting is pretty much at 12mm. And it's most noticeable here in the right corner. This is at f-stop 4, and as you can see, we move through to f-stop 5.6, to f-stop 8. The vignetting pretty much goes away by f-stop 8, but at f-stop 4, it is pretty noticeable, especially in that right corner, and it is noticeable as well in the left corner. But as you stop down, that'll pretty much disappear if you're worried about that. And that is pretty much it for the image quality, which overall is spectacular for a third-party lens. A very, very, very sharp lens with very good control on distortion, vignetting, and flare. It's very impressive, and definitely as good, or better maybe, than the Nikon. The last thing I want to talk about technically in this review is the focus speed of the lens, which I'm going to demonstrate for you right now. And the focus speed is actually very quick, from its absolute minimum distance out to its max. You can tell it's very, very quick. It is a little bit noisy, however, but that's really not that big a deal. And once again, from its minimum focusing distance all the way out to its max. You can see just how quick that focusing is, just as fast as any Nikon or Canon that has a silent wave focusing. And now the last thing I'm going to talk about with this lens is the use in the field. Now, of course, as you can imagine, this lens is for landscape photographers. So it's really important that it can take what the outdoor dishes to it. And trust me, this lens is built extremely well so it can take whatever the outdoors can dish. It can probably take rain, it can take dust, it can take even probably a fall and still work pretty well. So this is definitely a rugged lens that would be great for the outdoors. It can take what nature can dish out, pretty much anything, as long as you don't leave it out in the rain or something like that. In reality, this is the best lens of its class, easily as good as the Nikon 12-24mm or even the Nikon 10-24mm lens. Great for any DX camera user. This is really the lens I would choose if I was going to use an ultra-wide lens for DX, because it's not only quite a bit cheaper than the Nikon, but it performs almost just as well. This is definitely the best lens you can get for ultra-wide angle photography, unless you really absolutely need 10mm, in which case the Nikon 10-24mm is pretty much as good in terms of sharpness and stuff, but just isn't quite as well built as this, and also is a lot more expensive. So if you want the easy choice and are on a budget and want the best quality for your buck, this is definitely the lens you want to get. And this lens is very highly recommended. And this has been a review of the Tokina 12-24mm lens for DX cameras.